25 unmarked graves, 30 bodies with no names, and an anonymous caller who keeps insisting Nancy Guthrie is buried among them. Picture this. It's early June. The desert sun is already burning by 7 in the morning. A group of volunteers, not law enforcement, not FBI, not trained forensic investigators, are walking through dry scrubland in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. They have shovels. They have a GPS coordinate from an anonymous phone call. And they have a name, Nancy Guthrie. The caller told them she was buried here, in this patch of earth near a stream, under a grove of trees, a grave nobody dug officially, in a country that is 60 miles from the house where Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive. They start digging, and what they find in that same ground, in that same stretch of Sonoran desert that someone pointed them toward, is not nothing. It is something far more disturbing than nothing. Something that reframes this entire investigation in a way that no press conference and no official statement has fully reckoned with. They find more than 25 unmarked graves. Not Nancy Guthrie's grave. 25 unmarked graves. From April to May, the same search group had already uncovered the remains of more than 30 people in this same area. People with no names on file, no paperwork, no official death certificates, no families waiting for a call. 30 sets of human remains in a stretch of desert scrubland near the U.S.-Mexico border. And in the middle of all of it, an anonymous caller keeps insisting that somewhere in there, in that same ground, Nancy Guthrie is buried. When Brian Entin reported on this development, he didn't just cover the surface story. He went deeper. He asked the question that the anonymous tip, the volunteer search, and the 25 unmarked graves were all pointing toward. Not just did they find her, but what does any of this actually mean? What does Mexico mean for this investigation? What does the geography mean? What does the border mean? What does 30 sets of unidentified remains in the same area the caller pointed to mean for a family in Tucson that has been waiting since February 1st? The answer to those questions changes everything you thought you knew about where this case is going. And that is where we start tonight. For the first 100 days of this investigation, the Mexico theory was treated publicly like a long shot. Law enforcement said it. Mexican authorities said it. The FBI said it. The Sonora State Attorney General said it, in writing. There is no evidence, information, or objective elements suggesting U.S. citizen Nancy Guthrie entered, remained in, or traveled through the state of Sonora. The Sonora Commissioner of Criminal Investigation echoed that in February. The FBI, when asked directly, said there were no current leads suggesting Nancy was in Mexico. Most people following this case, tracking the tip line numbers, waiting on DNA results from Quantico, accepted that framing. Mexico was the speculation. The real investigation was in Tucson. The evidence was at Quantico. The answer was in the DNA. But Brian never fully closed the door on Mexico. Not because he was speculating, but because the geography demanded that he keep it open. Here's what he said in a May interview, talking to a retired SWAT commander about the Tejano-Oatem Nation Reservation, the vast tribal land that stretches across southern Arizona, that borders Mexico, that sits directly between Tucson and the international line. It's massive. It's right there between Tucson and Mexico. When I drove to Mexico, you drove through it. He drove to Mexico. Brian Entin personally drove south from Tucson through the reservation to the border. He wasn't speculating about the geography of this case from a newsroom in New York. He drove the route. He felt the distance or the lack of it. He understood, in a way a map on a screen can't communicate, how close Tucson is to a border that has historically been one of the poorest patrolled stretches of international boundary in the Western Hemisphere. 60 miles. That is the distance from the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, where Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home on the night of January 31st, to the city of Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. 60 miles on a highway where, according to the retired SWAT commander, there is an open stretch of border on the reservation. Getting into Mexico, as retired FBI agent Jeff Cortez told Brian in February, is for the most part much easier than coming into the United States. The Mexico theory was not crazy. It was geography. It was the specific, documented, drivable reality of what 60 miles from Tucson means when those 60 miles run south. May 10th, 2026. That is the date the first anonymous phone call came in. Not to the FBI, not to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not to any law enforcement agency with investigative authority in a Nancy Guthrie case. The call came to Buscando Corazones de Nogales. Say that name out loud. Buscando Corazones. It means looking for hearts in Spanish. It is a volunteer search collective based in Nogales, Sonora, a group of ordinary people, mostly women, mostly mothers, who have spent years combing the desert scrubland of Sonora looking for the remains of people who disappeared and were never found. Their leader is Ramona Guadalupe Ayala Ortiz. She is not a forensic investigator. She is not a law enforcement officer. She is a woman who has stood over enough unmarked graves in the Sonoran desert to understand what that ground means, what it contains, what it hides, and what it can reveal if you're willing to walk it carefully enough. On May 10th, someone called her group anonymously. A voice, possibly male, the reports aren't specific, claiming to know where Nancy Guthrie was buried, claiming the grave was in the Mariposa corridor near a stream near the U.S.-Mexico border, in terrain Buscando Corazones knew well from their other searches. Ayala Ortiz organized a search. May 16th, 2026. First attempt. The group went out, walked the area the caller described, searched near the stream, looked for disturbed earth, and any markers of a recently dug grave. They found nothing connected to Nancy Guthrie. But here's what they did find during their broader search activity in that same area in April and May. The detail that the headlines about the Mexico search largely buried beneath the easier story of search unsuccessful. More than 25 clandestine graves. At least 30 sets of unidentified human remains. People buried without names, without documentation, without families who had been officially notified, in the same ground where the anonymous caller said Nancy Guthrie was. People who are not Nancy Guthrie, but who were somebody's person, somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, somebody's husband, buried in the Sonoran desert in the corridor between Tucson and the border in a patch of scrubland that volunteer searchers found their way to through tips, persistence, and years of knowing where bodies end up in that part of the world. That is what they found when they dug. Not Nancy, but 25 unmarked graves and 30 sets of unidentified human remains in the same area, where someone kept calling to say Nancy was buried. The anonymous caller did not stop after the first search came up empty. This is the detail that separates this story from a one-day news event about a search that found nothing. The caller came back. After May 16th produced nothing, the caller called again. Same voice, same insistence, same location, but more specific, like someone who had watched the first search from a distance and was recalibrating. Buscando Corazones organized a second search. June 11th, 2026. This time the scale was bigger, more volunteers, more ground covered. The group went back to the Mariposa area with the updated tip, searching near the streams and the grove of trees the caller had described with increasing specificity. They found 25 more unmarked graves in the area. Not Nancy Guthrie, 25 more. The ground out there is full of them. That is the thing every headline about the Mexico searches has treated as a footnote. Grave after grave, body after body, unidentified human remains in a corridor that runs directly between the city where Nancy Guthrie disappeared and the international border. Then the third call came. This time the anonymous caller told Ayala Ortiz something specific. That the search groups had come close, that during the June 11th search they had passed near the right location without finding it, that the grave was beneath a grove of trees near one of the streams, close to where the clandestine graves had already been found. A third anonymous call from someone who appears to know not just where they're pointing, but how close the searchers are getting. Before the third call, before the June 16th and 17th searches, something happened on June 9th that most of the American coverage treated as a brief update and moved past. More than 50 people participated in a coordinated search of the Mariposa area. Not just volunteers from Buscando Corazones. Mexican National Guard personnel, Sonora State Police officers, AMIC agents, Search Commission staff, municipal civil protection, municipal police, and university criminology students. 50-plus people, multiple agencies, official and volunteer, working the same ground together in Mexico, looking for Nancy Guthrie. Read that list of participants again. The Mexican National Guard, state police from Sonora, university criminology students. These are not amateur investigators who caught a tip on social media. This is a coordinated, multi-agency, officially supported search operation in a foreign country, specifically organized around the possibility that an 84-year-old American woman who disappeared from a quiet Tucson neighborhood is buried in the Sonoran desert. They searched for 8 continuous hours through scrubland in June heat, in terrain Brian personally drove through. Terrain he described as massive, mostly desert, the kind of geographic space where the scale makes searching feel like looking for one grain of sand on a beach that stretches to the horizon. After 8 hours, the alleged grave had not been found. But the search did not end there. Ayala Ortiz confirmed the group received a third anonymous call, saying they were close, that there would be another search, that the ground was not done giving up what it held. Here is one of the most stunning institutional details in this entire chapter of the investigation. One that the official record confirms in language that is damaging in its bureaucratic straightforwardness. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, the agency leading the investigation, the agency with 150 FBI agents and analysts working alongside it, the agency whose sheriff has appeared on national television dozens of times to provide updates on the search for Nancy Guthrie, found out about the Mexico search from news reports. Not from Mexican authorities, not through the FBI's official channels, not through an interdepartmental communication or a formal notification from Buscando Corazones or the Sonora Attorney General's office. From the news, a volunteer group in Nogales, Sonora organized multiple major searches, including one with 50 people and multiple government agencies, of an area where an anonymous caller claimed Nancy Guthrie was buried, and the Pima County Sheriff Department found out because somebody saw it on television or read it in a newspaper. Let that land. This is an 84-year-old American citizen. She has been missing for more than 4 months. Her daughter is one of the most recognized journalists in America. The FBI director has been personally briefed multiple times. The President of the United States directed federal resources to her case. And a coordinated, multi-agency search of a potential burial site in Mexico happened without the primary investigating agency being formally notified, until reporters started calling them for comment. The Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a statement. They confirmed they were aware of reports about the anonymous tip. They confirmed it had been provided to a group in Mexico. They confirmed they had not been contacted by Mexican authorities. And they said, the investigation remains active and ongoing, and we will continue to follow up on any credible information. They also said the FBI and the sheriff's office had since reached out to Mexican authorities, not before the searches, but after the news reports, after 3 searches had already been conducted, after the third anonymous call had already come in saying the searchers were getting close. Let's pause the Nancy Guthrie timeline for a moment and talk about something the coverage of this case has almost entirely failed to address with the seriousness it deserves. 32 sets of human remains. More than 25 clandestine graves, found in the same patch of Sonoran desert in the Mariposa corridor near Nogales between April and June 2026 by a volunteer group that went out there because someone said an 84-year-old American woman from Tucson was buried there. Those 32 people are not Nancy Guthrie. Their deaths are not part of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Their families, assuming they have families looking for them, are not the family of a Today show co-anchor whose case has generated 40,000 tips and a $1.2 million reward. But they are people. They ended up in unmarked graves in the Sonoran desert, in the same corridor where cartel activity, human trafficking routes, and the specific geography of the U.S.-Mexico border have created a stretch of earth that is, as the search itself revealed, literally full of the bodies of people who disappeared without answers. Brian Entin has reported on the cartel dimension of this investigation with specific care. When asked directly whether cartel involvement was a serious investigative theory in the Nancy Guthrie case, he did not dismiss it. He said investigators were looking at all possibilities. He confirmed the FBI was in direct communication with Mexican authorities. He confirmed that the geography, the 60 miles from Tucson to the border, the open crossing on the reservation, the specific smuggling corridors that run through the Tejano-Autumn Nation, was a dimension serious investigators could not ignore. And now the searches in Mexico have physically confirmed what the geography always implied, that the ground on the other side of that border, in the area the anonymous caller pointed to, is not empty. It is not clean. It is the resting place of at least 32 unidentified people whose deaths happened in circumstances nobody has officially investigated. That is the answer investigators found when they dug in Mexico. Not Nancy Guthrie, but 32 people in unmarked graves in a corridor that runs directly from the city she was taken from. Who is this person? Nobody knows. And that is the fact that makes this dimension of the investigation feel like a ghost story. Except it is not fiction. The ground those volunteers are walking is real, the calls are documented, and the search has happened. Who calls a volunteer search group in Nogales, Mexico? Not law enforcement, not the FBI, not a journalist, and claims to know where a missing American woman is buried. Who calls back after the first search fails and gives more specific directions? Who calls a third time after the second search and says, "You were close"? There are several possibilities, and none of them are comfortable. The first is that the caller knows where Nancy Guthrie is, either because they were involved in her disappearance or because they have specific knowledge of the cartel or criminal network involved. Someone with inside information who, for reasons that may involve fear, loyalty, or calculation, isn't willing to call the FBI tip line, but is willing to point a volunteer search group toward the right area. The second is that the caller is providing false information, either for attention, for reasons related to their own relationship to high-profile cases, or to generate disruption in the investigation. A bad faith tip designed to send resources to Mexico and away from wherever the real answer is. The third, and this is the one the discovery of 32 bodies in the same area makes most chilling, is that the caller knows the ground, knows what is buried there, knows the geography of clandestine graves in the Mariposa corridor from direct experience, and is, for their own reasons, pointing investigators toward territory that may contain Nancy Guthrie's remains alongside 32 other people who never had a television special produced about their disappearance. Brian Entin's reporting has not identified the caller. No law enforcement agency has publicly named or described them. The calls are documented through Buscando Corazones' own account, reported to the press by Ayala Ortiz, who confirmed receiving the calls and confirmed the content of each one. But the voice behind the calls remains unidentified, and unidentified anonymous callers in active criminal investigations who demonstrate knowledge of specific geography, specific burial locations, and the proximity of searchers to their target are not a category of evidence that investigators can afford to ignore. Let's go back to that sentence because it is not a throwaway detail in Brian Entin's reporting. It is the single most physically committed act of investigative journalism in his entire body of work on this case. He drove to Mexico, not in a hypothetical sense, not as a rhetorical device for describing geographic proximity. He got in a car. He drove south from Tucson, through the Catalina foothills, through the city, through the suburban sprawl of the southern metro area, through the Tejano-Autumn Nation reservation, through the open desert, and to the Mexican border. He described the drive. He described the reservation, the massive, mostly desert expanse that lies between Tucson and the international line. The open border crossing on the reservation that the retired SWAT commander confirmed. The specific terrain through which someone could have moved an 84-year-old woman from the Catalina foothills to Mexico without touching a standard highway, without going through a formal international crossing, without appearing on the kind of surveillance infrastructure that cameras and official systems monitor. That drive is the reporting. The act of driving is the journalism. When Brian Entin tells his audience the Mexico connection is worth taking seriously, he isn't saying it from behind a desk. He's saying it from the experience of having personally measured the distance, not in miles on a map, but in road time, in terrain, in the specific physical reality of what 60 miles from Tucson actually looks like. And what it looks like is close. Too close. Close enough that the Mexico theory is not a long shot. Close enough that the anonymous caller's insistence, 3 calls, 3 increasingly specific sets of directions, persistent even after 2 failed searches, demands to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Here is where the institutional picture gets complicated, because the FBI's public statements about Mexico have been measured in ways that are specific and deliberate, and what they have not said is as important as what they have said. In February 2026, the FBI told Mexican authorities about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and communicated with officials in Sonora, but told those officials there were no current leads suggesting Nancy was in Mexico. In June 2026, after the volunteer searches and the news coverage of the anonymous tips, the FBI and the sheriff's office confirmed they had reached out to Mexican authorities again. Not proactively, not before the searches, but after. The Pima County Sheriff's Department stated the investigation remains active and ongoing, and that they will continue to follow up on any credible information. The sheriff's office said they had not been contacted by Mexican authorities. The Mexican Attorney General's office, the Sonora state prosecutor, issued a statement saying there was no evidence that Nancy Guthrie had entered, remained in, or traveled through Sonora, and that their investigation had not uncovered any information, even preliminary, to support a theory about her presence in the state. But here's the thing about those official denials. They're denials from the same state whose ground just revealed 32 sets of unidentified human remains in the area where the anonymous caller says Nancy is buried. They are denials from authorities whose formal investigative capacity in the Mariposa corridor is, by the account of the 32 bodies already found there, limited. They are denials from an institutional structure that learned about a multi-agency, 50-person search of a potential burial site in their own state from news reports. Official denials matter. They represent the formal assessment of the institutions making them. But they do not end the question, not when the ground is saying something different from what the institutional statements are saying. Here is where Brian Entin took the Mexico story and connected it to the most uncomfortable legal dimension of this entire case, one most people following it have not yet fully reckoned with. He had a no-body homicide prosecutor named Tad DeBiosi on his podcast. Not because investigators have given up on finding Nancy Guthrie alive, but because the investigation, for months in, has to grapple with every scenario, including the scenario that Nancy Guthrie is never found. DeBiosi is an expert in prosecuting homicide cases without a body. He has done it. He knows what it requires. When Brian Entin asked him about the specific challenges of the Nancy Guthrie case, DeBiosi was clear. He had concerns, not about the evidence, not about the DNA, but about specific elements of the investigation's handling. The kind of concerns a no-body prosecution case can be very unforgiving about when they surface in front of jury. The Mexico dimension makes that question more urgent. Not because Mexico confirms Nancy is dead, but because if the anonymous caller is telling the truth, if the grave is there in the Mariposa corridor, in the ground near those streams, beneath the grove of trees the third call described, then the path from evidence to prosecution runs across an international border. Cross-border evidence, cross-border crime scenes, cross-border biological material. All of it subject to international legal protocols, bilateral law enforcement agreements, and chain of custody requirements that multiply in complexity every time they cross a national boundary. And if the remains are found, if the 4th search, or the 5th, or the 6th finds what the caller keeps insisting is there, then the investigation immediately transforms from a missing persons case into a homicide. And prosecuting that homicide requires a chain of evidence that is clean, documented, legally sound, and capable of surviving the scrutiny of a defense attorney who knows exactly where the cross-border complications are. Brian Entin raised those concerns through the DeBiosi interview. Not to be dramatic, not to speculate about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but because a responsible journalist covering this case has to look at every scenario, including the hardest one, and make sure his audience understands what it would mean for the investigation if the ground in Mexico eventually gives up what the anonymous caller says it holds. On day 136 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the June 16th search was postponed. Buscando Corazones said conditions required a delay. The search was rescheduled for the following day. On June 17th, 2026, a 4th search was conducted in the Mariposa area of Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. The result? No confirmed connection to Nancy Guthrie. But Ayala Ortiz, the group's leader, did not say they were done. She did not say the tip was false. She did not say they had searched every inch of the area the caller described and concluded it was a dead end. She said they're going back. They are gathering more information. They are planning the next search. Why does someone keep going back to the same piece of desert after 4 failed searches? Why does someone keep planning another visit to a stretch of scrubland where Mexican authorities say there is no evidence of Nancy Guthrie's presence? Where the Pima County Sheriff's Department says it has not been formally contacted by Mexican investigators? Where the FBI's original assessment was that there were no leads suggesting she was in Mexico? Because the anonymous caller keeps calling. Because each call is more specific than the last. Because the third call said, "You were close." Because the ground in that area has already demonstrated 32 times in the bodies of unidentified people buried without names that it holds secrets official channels have not found. And because Brian Entin drove that road, he knows what 60 miles from Tucson to the border looks like. He asked the retired SWAT commander directly, should that reservation, that border corridor, be part of the investigation? The answer was absolutely. Here is what investigators found when they dug in Mexico. Not Nancy Guthrie, not a confirmed grave, not a body that closes the case and gives Savannah Guthrie and her family the answer none of them wanted, but all of them need. What they found was something else, something the headline "Search comes up empty" obscures and diminishes. They found evidence, physical, documented, undeniable evidence, that the corridor between Tucson and Nogales, the exact geographic window Brian Entin drove through, the window retired investigators called essential to the investigation, is actively used to dispose of people who have been made to disappear. 32 sets of unidentified human remains. 25 clandestine graves. In the same area where an anonymous caller keeps insisting an 84-year-old woman from Tucson is buried. That is not nothing. That is not a failed search. That is not a dead end. That is the geography of this case revealing itself. The physical landscape of the Mariposa corridor, which Brian Entin drove, which retired investigators said must be part of the investigation, which the anonymous caller has described with increasing specificity across 3, now 4 calls, is not an empty desert where nothing happened. It is a place where things happen. Things that don't make news unless someone like Savannah Guthrie has a connection to the person who might be there. Things that happened to 32 people before anyone with resources looked at the ground. And the answer that changes everything is this. The Mexico theory is not a long shot anymore. It is not fringe speculation from true crime forums. It is an active operational dimension of this investigation, with official participation from multiple Mexican government agencies, with an anonymous caller who has now called 3 times with increasing specificity, with a search group that has found 32 bodies in the same ground and is going back for a 5th time. And Brian Entin, who drove the road, who has sources inside the investigation, who debunked the private investigator rumor and confirmed Savannah Guthrie's confidence in the process, is watching this chapter of the case with the specific care of a journalist who knows that the answer, when it comes, may not come from Quantico. It may come from a grove of trees near a stream in the Sonoran Desert, 60 miles south of where Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive, in ground that is already full of people who disappeared without answers. The searches will continue, and Brian Entin will be there when something breaks. This channel will tell you the moment it happens, so subscribe and turn on notifications now, because the next call from that anonymous voice in Nogales may be the one that changes this entire investigation overnight.